Well, I'll tell you this story about Billy. Billy was at college, and rather unique individual. He's just a head. That's all he was. Didn't have a body, didn't have legs, nothing, just a head. And Billy, his mode of moving around was to roll. He would just roll around. So Billy would roll around, and he had graduated from high school, and he was rolling around college, and he sees this girl that he thinks sure would like to go out with. So he rolls up to her, looks up at her and says, "Hey," Sally was her name, "Sally, would you go out with me?" And Sally said to Billy, she said, "Billy, you got a great personality, but you're just a head. If somehow, someday you got a whole body, like legs and arms, then yeah, I would go out with you, but as it is, I just can't right now, you're just a head." He said, "Okay." So that night he wished and wished and wished that he would just have a body. And the next morning he wakes up and he's got one. He's got arms, legs, he's got a body, and he is so excited. His problem, though, is he's not used to having a body. He's used to just being a head and rolling around. And so when he gets out of bed, well, his arms and legs are kind of flopping everywhere because he's rolling. And he's starting to practice walking, and he's figuring it out a little bit, but when he gets kind of nervous or something, he breaks into a roll, and he's getting better. It's getting toward the end of the day, and he sees Sally across the road. And he is so excited that he starts walking, but he's so nervous, he breaks into a roll, and he's rolling across the road and gets hit by a truck and dies. And the moral of the story is quit while you're ahead. It's the moral. Everybody knows that. So, I should have probably quit while I was ahead before I told that story. You might remember this. I was at Cobb County, Georgia, about a year after this particular sticker was placed in the textbook. This sticker was voted on by an elected school board who did not like the teaching of evolution because they said it was not true, and that they wanted to provide a warning for their students just so the students could know, hey, this book is presenting some stuff that is not true, or at least has not been proven that you should check on. And so they all voted. Now, there again, elected board voted to put this in the school textbooks, the biology textbooks. And here's what the sticker said. This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact. Regarding the origin of living things, this material should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Now, young people, here's what I want you to know. Listen to me close. Christianity should be looked at exactly that way, with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Christianity is not afraid of the truth. Christianity is not afraid of questions. If there is something about Christianity that you want to know, I am convinced and have seen it any number of times. If you are honest and you want to know and you ask and you try to find the answer, when you get done with that, you'll be a stronger Christian than you were before. Sometimes we're told that, well, you Christians are just brainwashing your kids and you don't want them to look at stuff with an open mind. You don't want them to critically consider it. You don't want them to say, hey, what evidence do we have for the fact that Jesus was a person? How do you know the Bible is the inspired word of God? We're told that we don't want to answer those questions. Yes, we do. Those are great, fun questions. When you start looking at all the evidence, it becomes very clear that, oh, hey, yeah, Christianity is exactly what it says it is. Why would a person not encourage young people to look at something with an open mind and study it carefully and critically consider it? That's a good question. This particular sticker in the textbook was taken out because it went to the court and the non-elected, appointed district court judge said that this is unconstitutional. Now, why did he say it was unconstitutional? Because he said it violated the separation of church and state. Think about that before we go. That violated the separation of church and state. Really, number one, there's not a separation of church and state like it's presented. The idea that you can't say anything about God or you can't teach anything about the Bible in a public setting like a public school, that's false. It's never been what the Constitution said. The United States Congress has been opening with a prayer to God for more than 160 years. The idea that you can't say God, talk about Jesus, that's been false for years. Used to, the Bible was used as the reading and English textbook in many public school systems. That idea of separation of church and state is something that was made up and that is not in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, etc. However, that doesn't even matter in this discussion. What about this sticker says anything religious? Read it again. This textbook contains material on evolution. Evolution is a theory, not a fact, regarding the origin of living things. This material should be approached with an open mind, study carefully, critically consider. Is there anything that says anything about God? Anything about Jesus? Anything about the Bible? Why is this sticker not allowed in a book on evolution? Well, I think I'm going to show you and tell you, and I think you have come to the answer yourself probably fairly quickly. That is because if a kid were encouraged to look at the evidence for evolution with an open mind and study it carefully and critically consider it, that kid would never be an evolutionist. You can't encourage that kind of thing. And so instead of admitting we've got problems with evolution, and they just say, well, we don't want you to look at it with an open mind and study it carefully and critically consider it. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at the idea of evolution with an open mind. We're going to study it carefully. We're going to critically consider it and see if the science is there to back it. Because that's what you're told, that it's the scientific idea and creation is the non-scientific idea. That's false, but that's what you're told. So we're going to come to the idea of evolution. And remember, we quoted last night the atheistic evolutionary idea that in the beginning was matter and matter begot the amoeba. Well, that's a pretty big step. I mean, what does that mean? Here's what you're told according to the atheistic evolutionary idea, that hundreds of millions of years ago, actually they would say 3.8 billion years ago, there was a warm chemical soup that was just made up of chemicals like ammonia and hydrogen and things of that nature, and lightning hit the warm chemical soup, and somehow those chemicals got together and formed the first single-celled life. So evolution says you got life from non-living chemicals. And then that first single-celled life changed from one kind of life, that first single-celled amoeba, to every kind of life that we have in the universe today. It changed from a single-celled amoeba to a worm, and then a fish, amphibian, etc., all of them. Now you've got what we know to be the law of biogenesis. Law of biogenesis is a very solid law that is a law because, remember, we said you can't have a law if there's a single exception. There's never been a single exception to the law of biogenesis. And here's what it says. In the natural world, all life comes from previously existing life of its own kind. If you read any biology textbook, you're going to come to some discussion on some very simple but profound experiments that are in every biology textbook you'll ever see. For years, hundreds and hundreds of years, people thought organisms, animals, amoebas spontaneously generated. And they said, yeah, here's proof. Let me show you proof. If you take a T-bone steak and you put it on your kitchen counter in the middle of the summer and you leave a window open and come back in 2 weeks, guess what has spontaneously generated on that T-bone steak? Maggots. They just pop up from non-living chemicals. You didn't see any maggots crawl onto the steak. You didn't see any maggots fall out of the air onto the steak. They just pop up from the chemical composition of the air and the steak mixture, and maggots just form. They said, if you don't believe that, take some old sweaty rags, put some wheat in those rags, and stick them in the bottom of your barn, and come back in 2 months. Do you know what chemically is composed in a few weeks between old sweaty rags and wheat in the bottom floor part of a barn? Mice. They just spontaneously generate from the chemical properties of the... That's funny to us because we know that doesn't happen. But do you know, seriously, those were presented as scientific evidence that mice come from the spontaneous generation of sweaty rags and wheat. And they said if that's not enough, take a log, a part of a tree, put it in a wet ditch, and leave it for a few months, pop the bark off of that, and you'll see all kinds of things that spontaneously generated. You'll see bugs, worms, grubs, etc., and they just pop into existence from the chemical properties of that wet, dampness, and that wood. Okay, well, there's a guy in about 1660 by the name of Francisco Redi. There's a French guy by the name of Redi, or Redi, R-E-D-I. And in this particular experiment, he was proving that maggots don't spontaneously generate. And here's what he said. I'm going to do now, seriously, a second grader could do this experiment. It's very easy. He took some jars, put meat in the bottom of it, left them open. Took some jars, put meat in the bottom of it, sealed them with something like plastic wrap, hermetically sealed, airtight, so nothing could get in them. And he said, okay, here's a bunch of jars with meat. They're open. Here's jars that are sealed. Let's see what happens. Flies landed on the open meat. Maggots formed. Flies couldn't get in the meat that was sealed. No maggots formed. He said, boom, there you go. I believe the flies are producing the maggots. They said, no, your experiment's wrong, because air has the chemicals that cause the spontaneous generation, and you didn't let air get in. He said, okay, well, let's take it to the next level. Jars with meat unsealed, jars with meat sealed, and then he made a special group in the middle where he put meat in the bottom of the jars and put gauze, like netting substance, like gauze, whatever. What am I thinking? Medical gauze. Yeah, medical gauze that air can go through, but it's kind of netted. Okay, maggots formed on the meat that was not sealed. Maggots did not form on the meat that was sealed. Maggots formed on the netting of the central group, but not on the meat. And he said, there you go, I believe that flies are producing maggots. They said, well, okay, yeah. Looks like, so you don't believe in spontaneous generation? He said, no, I do. I just don't believe maggots spontaneous generate. They said, oh, okay. Okay, that persisted for another 200 years until a guy came along that was a fascinating individual, very, very intelligent. You might know this guy. If you went to your refrigerator this morning and you opened it up and you looked in and there was a gallon of milk and you looked on the side of that milk and it said this is pasteurized. And now, why would it say that? Well, because the cows that produced this milk lived in a... Don't say it. Don't say it. Don't say it's because they lived in a pasture, because you want to, but that's not right, is it? Pasteurized comes from the last name of a guy, Louis Pasteur, who invented a process that was designed to disprove spontaneous generation. And here was the problem. He was called to a place, actually it was a alcohol producing wine place that was producing wine, and the wine was getting bitter and ruining, and they couldn't figure out why. And so he zoomed in with a microscope on the grape skin. And he saw little things crawling around on the grape skin. And then somehow that was getting into the bottles, and it was crawling around then in the bottles. And he said, I think somehow we're passing some little live organisms from the grape skin to inside the bottles. And he said, I'm going to design an experiment for all those people that say that air's got to be in the process. Here's what we're going to do. He would put meat in the bottom of a special flask that had a long, very narrow S-shaped curve on it. And you're going to read this in every biology textbook you ever read. And he would boil the meat. He flash boiled it for about 30 seconds up to 100, well, he wouldn't boil it, get it up to about 160, 180 degrees for 30 seconds. Kill everything in it. Zoom in, there would be no moving around living microscopic organisms. He would let it sit there. He did several of these, I think scores of them. Let it sit there for a day, zoom in, nothing. A week, nothing. A month, nothing. Zoom in, if I understand it, some of them he waited a year. No microscopic organisms formed in the meat broth because they all got trapped in the S-shaped curve where gravity would pull them down. Then he would break the neck off so that the air went straight in and microscopic organisms would form. Okay, you understand this experiment. Here's what I mean by that. If you make chicken noodle soup and you leave it on your kitchen counter for 2 weeks and come back, do you encourage your children to eat it? Okay, no, because something's happened to the chicken soup. What is it? You might not be able to see things running around inside of it, but if you have a microscope like they did in 1860, which they didn't have back in 1660, you could zoom in and you'd see all kinds of little things swimming around, all kinds of little living things swimming around, bacteria. And so Louis Pasteur, once and for all, disproved the idea of spontaneous generation. He proved that you only ever get life in this material universe from previously existing life. That's in every biology textbook there is. But then you will read this statement. Sometimes it's in the next paragraph. But in the past it must have been different, because today we have life, and that must have spontaneously generated from non-living chemicals. In order for evolution to be true, you have to have spontaneous generation to have happened. And yet every single biology experiment ever done in the history of humanity shows you do not get life from non-living chemicals. Now, there's another aspect of law of biogenesis that you guys are real familiar with. Kindergartners love it. Mom, where did this peach come from? It came from a peach tree. Oh, okay. Where did that peach tree come from? Came from a peach seed. Where did that one come from? Oh, I mean, it came from a peach tree. Oh, okay. Where did that peach tree come from? Well, a peach seed. Where did that peach seed come from? You see the progression there. It's not really a progression. It's more like a cycle. Peach seed, peach tree, peach seed, peach tree, peach seed, peach tree. The second aspect of the law of biogenesis is, as you read it, that it comes from its own kind. You know, when I was moving to East Tennessee with my family, I was little. I remember I was about 5 years old, I think. And we had a dog that walked up to our house and looked like a big burly dog, and we named it Max, and then found out it was not probably a Max. It would have been better named Maxine. And Maxine was going to have babies. And she had several litters. And one of the times we were moving from East Tennessee to Middle Tennessee, she was in the baby way. And so we put her in the U-Haul truck in the floorboard, I remember, and we stopped that night and put her in the bathtub of the hotel room. Now, subsequently, I always thought we were weird for that, but I have learned that some people do that. So I'm not as weird from an as weird family as I thought. But we got up the next morning and looked in that bathtub. And Max had had 8 of the most the cutest baby hippopotamuses you have ever seen. And they were just right there. They're pygmies. And we sold those hippopotamuses, and that's how I went to Freed-Hardeman University. And that's what got me my start. Okay, no. Max, of course, a dog doesn't give birth to a full-blooded baby hippopotamus. No. They were half dog, half hippopotamuses. Okay, no. 80% dog, 20% birds. No. 90% dog, 10% lizards? No. Okay, what does a dog always have? Puppies. Always. A cat always has kittens. A cow always has a calf. You guys know basic biology, and so do I. The law of biogenesis says that life comes from previously existing life of its own kind. Do you know that is the experimental truth that we know to be fact in every single biology experiment ever done, ever? But if evolution is true, you had to have life that came from non-living chemicals that then produced something not of its kind. Now remember, Charles Smith, the atheist, said, in the beginning there was matter, and matter begot the amoeba, and the amoeba begot the worm, and the worm begot the fish, and the fish begot... It has to change from one kind to another. Do you know there has never been an example ever anywhere in the history of biology where you could verify that one kind of animal changed into another kind of animal? Now, sometimes the evolutionary scientist is going to say, well, yeah, hold on just a second. You can take a donkey and you can breed it to a horse and you can get a mule. Or you can take a horse and you can breed it to a zebra and you get a zorse or a hebra. I think one of those things. There's a couple names for those. Okay, yes, that's right. And in every single kind of creature, there is some latitude as to what you could get. You can take a pair of something like gray wolves, and you can breed them in a way within just a few generations that if you took a pair of something like gray wolves, dingoes actually are a little closer, the Australian dogs, and you took the smallest one from each litter, and you rebred that smallest one to the smallest one, and rebred that smallest one to the smallest one, and rebred that smallest one to the smallest, within a few generations, you could get something, depending on which kinds of features you selected, close to a Chihuahua. And you could take those dingoes and you could get the biggest one out of each litter, and the biggest one, and it had the most hair, and the biggest one the most hair, and the biggest one the most hair, and within a few generations you could get something like a Tibetan Mastiff. Because in the dingo DNA, there is a latitude that will get you everything from a Chihuahua to a Tibetan Mastiff. I'll tell you what you can't do, though. You can't ever get that kind, the dog kind, to get you something like a lizard or a horse or a cow. Regardless of what you've got out of that Mastiff to that Chihuahua, it's the dog kind. And here's what else is interesting about that. In order for evolution to be true, you would need to be adding genetic information. But if you then go over here to this Chihuahua and you look at it, it's got less genetic information than the original pair of dingoes. You can't now take that Chihuahua and somehow get it back to a dingo. You've lost genetic information. And if you take this Mastiff over here, you can't, from this Mastiff, get that Chihuahua out of it anymore. You've lost genetic information. And so for evolution to be true, you got to get life to come from non-life, and then you've got to get that life to change into different kinds of life, and you don't have to get it to do it once. You got to get it to do it millions of times. And the law of biogenesis says it's never happened. And it can happen, and it won't happen. Now, if you let a kid look at that with an open mind and you study that carefully, and you say to a young person who is thinking critically, has there ever been a time when a dog gave birth to something other than a dog? The answer to that is no. In order for evolution to be true, the answer has to be yes. And yet we know scientifically it's never happened, therefore evolution is not true. And that's a fact. That's a fact as plain as the nose on your face. Now, we went through a bunch of textbooks and found where they're teaching evolution and how they're teaching evolution, and this is what you will get. Let me help you with the word equivocation. I didn't know it for a long time. The word equivocation is a sneaky little word, and here's how it's used. If I were to say, if God is all-powerful, then what is stronger than God? Nothing. Okay, what am I holding in my hand right now? Nothing. So what I'm holding in my hand is stronger than God. It's kind of sneaky, isn't it? I mean, obviously, something's wrong there, but you can't really put your finger on it. Equivocation is when you take a word that has multiple definitions and you get somebody to agree with a definition, and then you slide in a definition that they don't agree with and say, see, you already agreed to this. So, if you look up the word evolution, it's going to say change over time. Do things change over time? Yeah. Do you look like you looked in high school? I don't. I know I don't. Does your house look like it looked 2 years ago or 5 years ago? Do things change over time? Okay, yeah, absolutely. So you believe things change over time? Yes. So you believe in evolution? Well, if evolution has changed over time, then okay, yeah, things change over time. So you believe that amoeba can turn into a human over millions of years? Well, no, hold on a second. I acknowledge that I believe that things change over time, but when you then take the other definition of going from non-living chemicals to a single amoeba and then to humans, that's a totally different definition. And so you will have things like this, and I don't know if you can see the bottom. I'll show it to you in just a minute. This is supposedly evolution in action. And this has been used in textbooks for scores of years to prove evolution. And here's how the story goes. Here's what you're told. Before the Industrial Revolution, the English peppered moth was about 95% light colored and about 5% dark colored. And if you are a bird and you're looking at these moths that have landed on a tree trunk, which one do you eat? Oh yeah, you eat the dark colored one because you can see it. You obviously aren't going to be eating something that you cannot see. And so we were told that this is why the moth population had this particular ratio, was because the birds were eating the dark colored and leaving the light colored. Now, they said after the Industrial Revolution, as the story was spun to you, the English peppered moths changed the ratio from 95% light to 95% dark, and from 5% dark to 5% light. And we were told that that's because the English peppered moth could now be seen in its light color on the soot-covered trunks of the trees. And so the English peppered moth ratio changed. And then we were told, as you look on the bottom, that this is melanism, evolution in action. And that was presented to prove to our young people that amoebas can turn into humans over millions of years. Now let's think about it just a second. If you've got an amoeba and you needed to go to a human, it's got to add about 3 billion bits of information. You need to add new genetic information. And so to prove that that can happen, you would have to show us an example of how you could add genetic information. This is a simple question. Before the Industrial Revolution, the moth population had the genes, had the DNA to produce 2 varieties of English peppered moth, light and dark. After the Industrial Revolution, the moth population had the genetic information to produce what? 2 varieties of moth, light and dark. Was there any new genetic information added? Okay, that would be like me saying this. Here's the illustration. I've got a dog who has 10 puppies, and 6 of them are light colored and 4 of them are dark colored. And this dog is walking across a frozen pond. The pond ice is not as thick as it should be, and in a tragic puppy accident, 5 of the light colored ones fall through the ice and die. Boom. Evolution in action. Because now we just changed the ratio of the puppy population from 6 light to 4 dark to 4 dark and 1 light. Is that change over time? Absolutely, positively. Does that get you from an amoeba to a human? No. You didn't add any new genetic information whatsoever. And yet this was presented to us as information that proves evolution to be true. But if you look at it with an open mind, you study it carefully, and you critically consider it, well, you see it's got some real problems. Now, this guy right here, Ernst Haeckel read On the Origin of Species by Natural Selection. The year after it was written in English, they translated it into German. Haeckel was a German guy. He read it and he said, wow, this is amazing. I'm going to come up with something that proves this. And he came up with the law of embryology, where he said ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. It's exciting, isn't it? Just makes you feel smart, even hearing it, doesn't it? Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. You know, say that 5 times real fast. Can you? You're thinking about it, though, aren't you? Ontogeny recapitulating. No, that's going to be tough. Let me tell you what the problem with his ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. Ontogeny is the growth of an embryo. Phylogeny is the alleged evolutionary history of that particular creature. And so here's what he was saying. If we say that humans evolved from amoebas, you could show up in the embryo development of a human at each given stage, and you could find it in its little stage. So if you showed up at the right time, it'd be in a fish stage. And so that's what you see him, put him up on the top with those gill slits, he said. And if you show up at the next right time, you'll see it in a lower mammal stage. And if you show up at the next right time, you'll see it in a lemur or monkey-like stage. And then if you show up at the end of it, you'll see it in its close to human stage. And so he had these pictures that proved it. He said, yeah, I mean, look, they all got gill slits. In 1885, when he put this out, even the embryologist at the time said something like, Haeckel, that doesn't really look like the embryos we're dealing with. Where'd you get those pictures? Because the embryos we're dealing with look different. He said, well, I did draw some of them from memory. Okay. And now get this. He said, and sometimes I'd draw one embryo and label it 3 different things. I'd draw a dog embryo and I'd label a dog, a pig, and a human. I'd draw it 3 different times, label it 3 different things, and it'd be the same embryo. And they said, well, didn't you feel bad about this? This is science. We're supposed to be dealing with this. He said, no, we do this kind of stuff all the time. It's no big deal. It proves what we already know. Well, and so as you started looking at that, number one, no, it didn't prove what you already knew. Number two, that idea of gill slits, humans never have gill slits. Those aren't gill slits. Those are folds that develop into different things, and they aren't even close to a fish stage. Since 1885, we have known that the Haeckel similarity embryos are absolutely false from just a few years after they were ever put out. Now, this is in 2000 in Natural History magazine by Stephen Jay Gould. Haeckel's distortions did not help Darwin. Here's what he says. Haeckel remains most famous today as the chief architect and propagandist for a famous argument that science disproved long ago, but popular culture has never fully abandoned. He said science has disproven this. Now notice what he says right here. We should therefore not be surprised that Haeckel's drawings entered 19th century textbooks, but we do, I think, have the right to be astonished and ashamed by a century of mindless recycling that's led to the persistence of these drawings in a large number, if not most, of the textbooks. He said, yeah, they're in all the textbooks. Okay, now hold on just a second. Read it again. Do you see where we're going with this? He said, we do, I think, have the right to be astonished and ashamed by a century of mindless recycling. No, you don't have the right to be astonished or ashamed. Because what did you say in Cobb County, Georgia in 2002 you didn't want kids to do? You said you didn't want them to look at it with an open mind. You said you didn't want them to look at it critically and study it carefully. You have concocted a system of mindless recycling. And then when somebody points out to you that that's exactly what you've got, then you act astonished and ashamed and say, oh yeah, blah, blah, blah. No, that's what you've drawn up. When you don't let kids ask questions in school like, what's the evidence for creation as it compares to evolution? When you don't let kids ask, is it true that the law of biogenesis says that things produce after their own kind and life comes from previously existing life of its own kind? Is that true? How could evolution be true? When you just tell kids, hey, quit asking questions and you just accept this and you can learn about how it's wrong later, well, you're going to get centuries of mindless recycling. That's what you've ordered up, and that's what you will get. In 2010, I was up at Swartz Creek, and I was talking about this information. It was about 13 years ago now. I say this because, okay, we've known Haeckel's false since 1885. We've known that. Okay, this is 2010. This is, 125 years later? This girl writes me back. She says, on May 29th, you came to Michigan and preached on creation evolution. It was a very good sermon. I found it very interesting. What I found even more interesting is that this week in my biology class, we learned about the theory of evolution. During this segment, we had to do worksheets on evolution. 2 of the main things we did were on the peppered moss and similarity in embryos. Those were 2 things you proved false during your sermon. You taught us that these things were proven false, but still put in textbooks and taught in schools today. I was astonished and humored that these 2 false teachings showed up in my high school the week following your sermon. Wow. It's pretty awesome. Except how many schools taught that week that we didn't get to the congregation before? Thousands? And so, yeah, that's exciting for this one ninth grade biology student who gets to see the truth of this, but where else is anybody getting to see the truth of this? You know, they've kind of adjusted the similarity with embryos. Now they still use Haeckel's exact same pictures, but they say, well, okay, we're not saying that it reaches a stage. We're just saying that the similarity proves that evolution is true. Okay, so similarity proves that something evolved from some type of organism other than its kind? That's interesting. If I were just to ask you a real quick question, how many wheels does your car have? 4? You know, most likely. What kind of material are the tires made out of on your car? Rubber? Okay. That must mean that they were all designed and created or came from one factory, and they were all related in some way because they all have 4 wheels and all the tires are rubber, or could it be that if there are similarities in things, that would mean that there was a common designer that designed things to all use the same types of surfaces and roads and things in the usable area, meaning, hey, if you can say because things are similar, they're evolved from each other, why couldn't a person say because things are similar, that proves that they had a common designer? Similarity doesn't prove anything. I don't think an evolutionist would let me use similarity to prove a common designer, although I think it's a great argument. But certainly similarity can't be used to prove a common ancestor because it's just as good of evidence for a common designer. So even though they have now in about 2020 changed the argument slightly and said, okay, well, we're not really using Haeckel's embryos, although lots of times it's the exact same pictures. We're just saying similarity means that evolution is true. No, it doesn't. Similarity has never proven a common ancestry. Now, it could, in some cases, if you had a child that looked like his father or you had a daughter that looked like her mother, you could say, okay, those people are related. But often, similarity would be much better evidence for a common designer than a common ancestor. And so this idea that somehow Haeckel's embryos or similarities proves anything related to evolution is absolutely false. Now, how many of you have seen this in a textbook? Lots of times our older generation absolutely has. This is supposed horse evolution. There's a whole shrine in the New York Natural History Museum to this particular horse evolution. And here's the interesting thing about that. The uniform continuous transformation of Hypertherium into Equus, so dear to the hearts of generations of textbook writers, never happened in nature. Well, what do you mean it never happened in nature? I mean, right there it is. That's it, isn't it? From the Eohippus all the way up to modern Equus, it's been presented for decades as this is what we know to be true about the evolution of horse. And yet, when you start getting into the evidence of it, number one, you can't get Hyracotherium into a modern Equus because it's not the same kind of creature. And number two, there's no real evidence for it anyway. And the only place that anybody ever saw it wasn't in nature. It was in textbook drawings. And so as you continue with that kind of thing, you look at that idea, the homology, the similarities. The fact of the matter is that creation, as it is stated in Genesis chapter 1, and as you see it in real life, answers all of the challenges that evolution can't answer. Meaning, if in this material universe life comes from previously existing life of its own kind, then that means life had to start somewhere. Where did it start? And why does it now produce after its own kind? Do you know if you go to Genesis and you start in about verse 16, 17 of chapter 1, when on day 3 God creates the flowers, grass, and trees, do you remember what he says to the vegetation when he creates it? Therefore be fruitful and multiply after your own kind. And on day 5, when he creates the birds and the fish, he says, be fruitful and multiply after your own kind. And on day 6, when he creates the humans and the animals, land living, he says, be fruitful and multiply after your own kind. the scientific evidence points overwhelmingly to the fact that if you just take what you know to be true, just what you know, life comes from previously existing life of its own kind. That in nature, as you see a built-in adjustment in DNA, it's an adjustment that allows an organism to have a latitude, but ultimately stops at the kind mark. Here's what's being said by the evolutionists. They're basically saying, okay, look, if we could get an organism to change just a little bit over a small number of years, then we could get it to change a lot over millions of years. This was done by Charles Darwin when he found the Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands. Maybe you'll remember those. They've been used as evidence for evolution for years, and here's what happened. As you look at Darwin's finches, when there is a drought, the average size of Darwin's finches' beaks change by about 1 to 5 millimeters. And the finches with thicker, bigger beaks actually live better than the ones with smaller ones. And so Darwin looked at those and said, okay, I think that somehow there was one type of finch, and then when there was a drought, then the ones with bigger beaks lived, and he then extrapolated from that and said, hey, if you could get a finch beak to adjust on average 4 millimeters in a 10-year period, well, what could you get in 100 years? 40 millimeters. Or 400? Or what could you get in 1,000 years? Maybe a snout. What could you get in 1,000,000 years? Maybe teeth. And basically said, if you can get some change, then you can get every change. But the law of biogenesis says that's not possible. That there's a mark at which, there's a line at which that change stops. And that's the kind mark. You understand this. I mean, suppose that you were wanting to run a marathon, and you said, okay, I'm gonna run a marathon, and I'm going to see how fast I can do a mile. And so you kind of slow, and you start off, and it takes you 10 minutes to run 1 mile. And you think, I'd like to work on that. And you say, okay, I'm going to train for a week. And so you train for a week, and within a week you shave off 1 minute of your time. And now you're running the mile in 9 minutes. And you think, oh, okay, that's pretty good. I think I can do a little bit better now. And in another week you shave off another minute. And now in 2 weeks you're running 8 minutes. In another week you shave off another minute. And so now in 3 weeks of training you're running it in 7 minutes. That's awesome. In 7 more weeks, how long is it going to take you to run a mile? 0 minutes. You're shaving a minute a week. Except there's something wrong with that, isn't there? At some point, you don't shave off any more minutes because there's a limit to how fast you'll ever run a mile. Mine was back at about 8.5 minutes. But, I mean, some people can make it all the way to about 4. But you don't shave any more time off of that. God created living beings with the built-in line that cannot be crossed. Horses do not give birth to calves. Dogs do not give birth to kittens. Fruit flies never give birth to lizards, and snakes never give birth to spiders. But do you know if evolution were true, that idea that God laid down in Genesis chapter 1 of things producing after their own kind could not be right. And yet we know every single scientific experiment ever done shows that it is. Folks, in the beginning, God is still the very most biologically sound statement ever uttered. And the textbooks that teach opposite from that, we need to explain to our kids that they need to have an open mind. They need to study this stuff carefully and critically consider it. And I'm telling you, when they do, and if you'll encourage them and help them, they will come out with a stronger faith and be stronger Christians than they ever were before they even started. And that's the kind of people we need to present to our young people. And we say, we're not afraid of this. This is not frightening to us. We have the truth. It's on our side. Let's look at it all and be honest and come to the right conclusion.